She entered his castle as nothing more than a poor servant girl, yet the vampire king saw a light within her that could burn away the darkness he had carried for centuries. The emperor who lived on blood found himself, for the first time, losing to a human heart, and her fate rose from dust to the throne. But when love and hunger stood face to face, the choice became hers. To save her human life or embrace the eternal darkness. People in the village still talk about the night the poor girl walked into the vampire king's home, carrying nothing but a torn shawl and a stubborn kind of hope. They say the moment she crossed his gates, the future of both monsters and humans began to change, even though no one understood it yet. The girl's name was Liora, and all she wanted that evening was a place to work, a roof that did not leak when it rained, and enough bread to keep her younger brother alive. The village was cruel in quiet ways, doors that closed when she passed, eyes that looked away when she begged. She had already sold her mother's ring to buy medicine. Now, with winter crawling over the mountains and frost biting at her bare fingers, there was nothing left to sell except her courage. That at least she still owned. Everyone knew the castle on the hill. They called it the Vampire King's Nest, a place where light went in and never came back out. Children were warned not to look at it too long, as if the stone itself could see into their souls. Stories said the king was a monster who fed on fear and lived on blood, a creature so old he had forgotten his own reflection. Leora listened to those stories for years, and then one afternoon she heard a different one. The baker's wife, who had always slipped Leora the hard, unwanted ends of bread, whispered it while tying a bundle of herbs. "They say the king lost his last human servant to sickness," she murmured, avoiding Leora's eyes. "They say he sent word, anyone brave enough to serve in the castle will never be hungry again." Her hands trembled as she spoke, as if she regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. "Don't go, child, monsters do not keep promises." But when Leora went home and found her brother shivering beside an empty fire, his lips pale and dry, the word monster started to sound different. If the king truly was a monster, then perhaps he could survive losing one more poor girl. Her brother could not. So that night, Leora wrapped her thin shawl over her hair, kissed his forehead, and walked alone toward the dark line of the forest where the path to the castle began. The air grew colder with every step. Branches tangled above her like black fingers, scratching at the sky. The moon slid in and out of torn clouds, pouring silver over the stone road ahead. Leora could hear her own breath, see it puff out in tiny ghosts. The closer she came to the castle, the quieter the world became, as if even the insects were holding their breath. She hated the way her hands shook, so she curled them into fists, nails pressing half-moons into her palms. When she finally stepped out of the trees, the castle rose before her, its towers cutting the night like broken teeth. Iron gates stood at the end of the path, taller than any building in her village, their black bars laced with strange symbols that glowed faintly blue. The stone walls were dark, but a few windows flickered with slow, tired light like eyes that hadn't decided whether to close or watch. Leora stopped several steps away and swallowed hard. No one was here to greet her. No guard, no servant. Just the hum of the wind and the thud of her own speeding heart. For a long moment, she simply stood there, fingers tight on the strap of her small cloth bag. She thought of turning back, of curling up beside her brother and facing the winter together, even if it meant starving side by side. But then she remembered how light he had felt when she lifted him, how his voice had cracked when he tried to say her name. She stepped forward, lifted a hand that would not stop trembling, and knocked on the iron gate. The sound echoed, too loud in the silent air, like someone slamming a drum in an empty church. Leora winced. Before she could knock a second time, the symbols along the bars flared brighter, and with a soft, heavy sigh, the gates began to open inward on their own. No chains rattled, no hands pushed. The iron simply moved, slow and smooth, as if the castle had been waiting for her and had finally decided to let her in. She forced her feet to walk through, every step feeling both wrong and strangely right at the same time. Inside the walls, the courtyard stones were slick with a thin layer of frost that glimmered beneath the moon. A few leafless trees clawed at the sky from patches of hard soil, and at the far end stood a massive wooden door, tall enough for giants, studded with dark metal and lit by two lanterns whose flames burned a deep, steady gold. Leora approached and hesitated again. Before she could touch the door, it opened with a soft groan. Warmth spilled out, carrying the smell of old wood, candle wax, and something else she could not name, cold flowers perhaps, or rain falling on stone. No one stood in the doorway. The hall beyond lay wide and dim, lined with tall windows and flickering candles in iron holders. Shadows bent and stretched like quiet, listening creatures. She stepped inside, hugging her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Each footfall echoed gently on the polished floor. Along the walls hung portraits in heavy frames, men and women in dark clothing, their expressions serious, their eyes almost too real. Leora avoided looking at them for long, afraid they might suddenly move. At the very end of the hall, beneath a high arched ceiling, she saw a throne carved from black stone and silver, standing on a raised platform. It was empty. Leora's throat tightened. She had imagined a dozen terrifying scenes, a king with blood on his mouth, a room full of servants with hollow eyes. She had not expected to walk alone into an empty, echoing hall. Her voice surprised her when it came out, small but steady. "Hello," she called. I came about the work." Silence followed, stretching out until it became a weight on her chest. Then, very softly, something shifted in the shadows above the throne. A tall figure stepped forward from a balcony she had not noticed, his cloak trailing behind him like spilled midnight. He walked down a narrow stair that curved along the wall, each step measured and almost soundless, as if he weighed less than air. When he reached the last step, she saw him clearly. His hair was pale as moonlight, pulled back from a face that was too still, too perfect to be ordinary. His skin held the color of frost, yet there was nothing weak about him. His shoulders were straight, his movements graceful but sharp, like a sword sliding from its sheath. His eyes were the only thing that did not look cold. They burned a deep, strange red, rimmed with shadows, reflecting the candlelight as if it hurt him to see it. Leora's breath caught. Every story she had heard told her to run. But then, unexpectedly, the king did something none of those stories had prepared her for. He stopped a few steps away, tilted his head slightly, and smiled. It was a small, careful smile, as if he was afraid it might break if he let it grow too large. "You are shivering," he said quietly. His voice was low and smooth, with the softness of worn velvet. "Come closer to the fire." Only then did Leora notice the fireplace to her left, where a steady flame crackled, throwing gold over the stone. The kindness in his words did not match the danger in his eyes. She hesitated, dry mouth pressing against her teeth, but ended up moving closer anyway. Her legs, it seemed, trusted warmth more than fear. "You came alone," the king observed, following her with unhurried steps. He did not loom over her, he gave her space, stopping at a polite distance. "No one waits for you outside the gates." It was not really a question, but Leora answered anyway. "My brother," she said, forcing her voice not to shake. "He is sick. I came to earn enough to care for him." Something flickered across the vampire king's face. It was not hunger, it was not cruelty. It was something Leora did not expect to see in a monster's expression, understanding. For a heartbeat, his shoulders dropped as if he carried a weight that responded to her words. "I see," he murmured. "You must care for him very deeply." "He is all I have," she replied, and the truth of that warmed her eyes with unshed tears. She blinked them away, angry at herself for showing weakness before a predator. "If there is work, I will do it. I learn quickly. I do not complain." After a pause, she added, almost like a shield, "And if you decide you do not want me here, I will not cause trouble. I will leave quietly." The king's gaze lingered on her face longer than felt comfortable. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a hint of something fragile, like a crack in old glass. "So ready to accept being unwanted," he said softly, almost to himself. "Humans do not change as much as they believe." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The silence between them filled with the soft snap of the fire and the distant groan of the great house settling in the cold. The king moved closer by one step, and though Leora's instincts screamed at her, this time she did not move back. His eyes searched hers, not like a hunter sizing up prey, but like a man searching for a memory he had lost a long time ago. "What is your name?" he asked. "Leora." He repeated it under his breath, as if testing how it felt. "Leora." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when they opened again, the red in them looked deeper, darker. "I am King Valerius. This is my home, and it is not a safe place for the careless." He paused, then added with a faint, rueful smile, "But you do not look careless." Despite herself, Leora felt a small spark of courage rise in her chest. "I am afraid," she admitted, "but I came anyway. Does that count for something in your home, your majesty?" For the first time, his smile reached his eyes. It made him look less like a creature from nightmares and more like a man who had once known how to laugh. "It counts for more than you think," he said. "Courage is a language I remember." He motioned toward a small table near the fire, where a simple plate of bread and cheese sat beside a cup of dark liquid. "Sit, eat. No servant of mine begins their work hungry." The word servant struck her with a mix of relief and dread. So he would hire her. That meant food for her brother, warmth for the winter. But it also meant staying in this place where shadows whispered and a king with red eyes watched her with an intensity that both frightened and strangely comforted her. She sat slowly, her fingers brushing the rough edge of the bread. It was still warm, and when she tore off a piece and tasted it, she nearly choked on the emotion that rose in her throat. It had been a long time since anything she ate had been fresh. Valerius watched her silently, his expression unreadable, his hands folded behind his back. As she ate, she became aware of something strange. The closer he stood, the quieter the rest of the castle seemed. The usual creaks and distant moans of an old building faded until there was only the fire, her heartbeat, and something else. A faint, almost musical hum in the air, like a song at the edge of hearing. It made the hairs on her arms stand up, but not entirely from fear. "Why are you really here, Leora?" Valerius asked suddenly. "There are villages in every direction. Why send a child to the lair of a monster when there are other houses to beg at?" She met his gaze, surprised at how easily the answer came. "Because all the other houses are full of people who are afraid to lose what little they have. They close their doors and call it safety. But you," she hesitated, then spoke the thought that had carried her up the hill. "You already have everything and still you sent for help. That means you might know how it feels to lose things." His eyes widened just a fraction. For a moment, the mask of the ageless king slipped, and underneath Leora saw something raw and aching. Loneliness, regret, a hunger that had nothing to do with blood. Without thinking, she added quietly, "And if I am wrong, if you really are only a monster, then at least my brother won't have to watch me starve." Valerius inhaled sharply, as if her words had struck him in a place long frozen. The candles around the hall flickered all at once, casting wild shadows over the walls. His hand, pale and elegant, tightened briefly at his side. He took one step closer, then another, until he stood just across the table from her. Leora's pulse thundered in her ears, but she lifted her chin and held his gaze. If this was the moment he decided to be the monster the stories promised, she would face it standing. Instead, he did something she never expected. Very slowly, as if handling something precious and fragile, Valerius reached out and took her wrist, turning her hand palm up. His touch was cool but gentle, his fingers careful. He stared at the inside of her wrist, at a small birthmark she had never thought about, a faint shape that looked almost like a crescent moon wrapped in a thorned vine. All the color that existed in his pale face seemed to drain away, leaving him almost translucent. His eyes lifted to hers, burning now not with hunger but with shock, with fear. "This mark," he whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Who gave this to you?" "No one," Leora breathed, just as confused. "I was born with it, it is nothing." Valerius let her wrist go as if it burned him. He took a step back, then another, his gaze still locked on her as though she had grown fangs instead of him. The soft hum in the air rose into a low, trembling note that made the candles quiver. "It is not nothing," he said, and for the first time there was real terror in the vampire king's voice. "That mark has not been seen in this world for 100 years." His lips parted, shaping a name he had not spoken aloud in a long time. "The girl who wore it last died in my arms the night the curse began." He stared at her as if she were a ghost returned from the grave, his hands shaking at his sides. "Leora," he whispered, each syllable heavy with a past she did not know. "Tell me who sent you to my door." "No one sent me," she said, her voice rough with confusion. "I walked here by myself. I chose to come." Valeria stared at her as if she had claimed to fly. His jaw tightened, and he began to pace in a slow circle, the hem of his dark cloak whispering against the stone. The candles followed him with their light as if pulled on invisible threads, shadows sliding up the walls like water climbing glass. "You do not understand," he murmured, more to the room than to her. That mark only appears on those tied to the old promise. It does not choose at random, it does not. His words broke off, and he looked at her again, studying every line of her face. You say you chose to come, why this night, why my gate? Leora opened her mouth to answer, then hesitated. The real reason sounded foolish even in her own head, but lying to a creature who could probably hear her heartbeat felt impossible. She swallowed. Because last week I began to dream of this place, she confessed quietly. I saw a hallway of stone, candles on the walls, a door with iron shaped like vines. Each time I woke up, my heart was racing, and I felt less afraid of the castle than of staying where I was. Valerius stopped pacing. His back was to her, shoulders drawn tight as if the air itself had turned heavy. Did you see me in these dreams? He asked. No, she said, only the door and a voice I could not quite hear. It sounded lonely. The word slipped out before she could catch it. At once the air in the room shifted. The low hum she had felt earlier deepened, like a quiet chord struck on unseen strings. Slowly, Valerius turned back toward her. His eyes were no longer just red, they held the reflection of something fragile, like a mirror holding an old memory. You speak carelessly, he said, but there was no real anger in it. Yet you touch the truth. He drew in a long breath that he did not need and let it out with visible effort. Sit still, Leora. I will tell you why that mark terrifies me. He did not sit. He stayed standing, one hand braced on the back of a stone chair, the other hanging at his side, fingers curled as if they wanted to hold something that was no longer there. His voice, when it came, was low and even, the voice of someone who had repeated a story to himself in silence for many years. A century ago, he began, this world was not divided as it is now. Humans and my kind lived in a fragile peace. There were rules, you did not hunt us in daylight, we did not take your children in the dark. There was fear, of course, but there was also something like respect. He tasted the unfamiliar word slowly. And then the fear grew faster than the respect. A war began in shadows, and both sides lost more than they expected. He looked down at his own hands as if expecting to see blood on them. There was none, only pale skin that caught the light like polished stone. To stop the war, an old order of healers created a promise, a binding between their strongest seer and the king of vampires. A mark appeared on her skin, the same as yours. She came to this castle, unarmed, with the courage of someone who believed in kindness more than in monsters. Her name was Liora. The name touched the air like a prayer. Leora felt it settle over her, soft but heavy, like a cloak placed on her shoulders. Alara believed we could be better than what we had become, Valerius continued. She believed I could be better. She spoke to me as if I were a man and not a legend told to frighten children. She ate at my table. She walked my halls. In her presence, the hunger in me grew quieter. He fell silent for a moment, and Leora saw something change in his face, a softness, almost a light. It was gone a heartbeat later, replaced by a shadow of old pain. But fear is a stubborn thing, he said. The humans who sent her did not truly trust me, and my own court did not trust her. One night in their terror, both sides struck at once. Arrows in the dark, poison in the wine, 100 small betrayals woven together. Alara stepped between us, trying to stop the violence she had come to end. He looked up, and his eyes seemed older than the castle itself. She died in my arms before I could reach the one who truly meant her harm. Her blood fell on this floor, her mark burned like fire, and with her last breath she bound my life to the promise she had tried to keep. Leora listened, her fingers pressed together so tightly her knuckles ached. There was no graphic detail in his words, no cruel delight, only a quiet grief worn smooth by time. What curse, she asked softly, what did she do to you? Valerius's smile was small and without joy. She knew that if I gave in to fury, if I answered death with more death, the world would drown in it. So the promise she made, the one that began peace, had to be sealed in a different way when she died. I became the keeper of the hunger I once unleashed. My strength remained, but every act of cruelty, every careless death by my kind, burns me from the inside. I feel it all. He touched his chest lightly. A constant reminder of what was lost. He walked closer to her again, slow enough that she could see every step and decide not to flinch from any of them. Since that night, no one has worn that mark. The old order faded, the war sank under new stories, and I learned to rule in the quiet, trying to balance what must be done with what should never be done again. His gaze dropped to her wrist, where the faint crescent and thorns still rested like a secret written on skin. Until you walked through my gate. Leora felt the world tilt just a little, as if the floor had shifted under her chair. She wanted to say this was a mistake, that she was just a girl from a forgotten village with a sick brother and thin shoes. But the fear in the Vampire King's eyes would not let her speak those small, safe words. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Do you think I am her, Alara?" Valerius shook his head slowly. "No, you are not a ghost. Your heartbeat is your own. Your courage is shaped by different wounds." His voice grew gentler. "But marks like yours do not appear without purpose. They are a calling and a danger." "To me," Leora whispered. "And to you," he said. "If the ones who feared Alara more than they feared me ever learned that the mark had returned, they would come again. There are still those, human and not, who would rather see the world ruled by terror than healed by trust." The room felt suddenly smaller. Leora glanced toward the door she had entered, imagining invisible threats waiting beyond it. "I did not ask for a mark," she said, fighting the wobble in her voice. "I only asked for work, for food, for a chance to save my brother." There was silence, long and heavy. Then Valerius straightened and forced his shoulders back, the king's mantle settling over his grief like armor. "You should leave," he said quietly. "Tonight, I will send you away with a cart of food, medicine, and money enough to keep you safe for a time. It is the kindest thing I can do for you." The words hit Leora like cold water. Kindest. Safer. It was everything she should want to hear, everything she had prayed someone would say to her in that village of closed doors. And yet, as she imagined turning her back on this hall, on the king who spoke of hunger and regret with such fragile honesty, a knot tightened in her chest. "If I leave," she said slowly, "your curse stays. The people who once broke the promise keep winning, nothing changes." "Nothing more will be lost," he countered gently. "That is enough." "Is it?" Her voice surprised her with its strength. "You have carried this pain for 100 years. You say you feel every cruel act. How many more centuries will you stand here alone, hoping that simply not getting worse is the same as getting better?" For a moment, they simply looked at each other. A poor girl wrapped in a worn shawl, and an immortal king wrapped in a history heavier than iron. The fire crackled softly between them, throwing their shadows together on the wall until they almost looked like one figure instead of two. Valerius was the first to look away. "You speak like her," he whispered, "even without knowing what you ask." He turned toward one of the tall windows where the night pressed against the glass like a living thing. "Leora, I am not afraid of you. I am afraid of what your presence will awaken in this castle, in my people, in me." Leora stood up, her legs felt shaky, but they held. "I am afraid too," she admitted. "Of you, of your stories, of this mark, but I am more afraid of being the kind of person who runs away just when something might finally change." She drew in a breath that tasted of smoke and old stone. "You said courage counts for something in your home. Let me stay. If there is danger, I will face it. I have been afraid my whole life. It has never saved me." The statement hung in the air between them, simple and true. Valerius closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they glowed faintly, not with hunger, but with the strain of a decision that pulled in two directions at once. "You are stubborn," he said at last, and there was the barest hint of reluctant admiration in his tone. "That, too, is a language I remember." He was silent for a long heartbeat, then another. Finally, he inclined his head, the gesture graceful and resigned. "Very well, you may stay, but you must listen to me if you wish to live long enough to regret this choice." He stepped closer and spoke in a quieter voice meant only for her. "There are rules in this castle. You will not walk the east wing after the third bell. You will not open any door that bears the mark of three interlocking circles. If you hear voices calling your name from an empty corridor, you will come directly to me and nowhere else. Do you understand?" A shiver ran through Leora that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yes," she said, "I understand." "Good," he straightened the king once more. "You will have a room near the kitchens. My steward, Corvin, will show you your duties in the morning. For tonight," he hesitated, then added, "for tonight you may sleep. You have done enough brave things for one day." Sleep, the word sounded impossibly kind. Leora nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily with curses and lost seers turning circles in her mind. Valerius turned toward the side of the hall, where a narrower passage stretched into shadow. Before you rest, he said, there is something you must see so you will understand what you have walked into. He moved toward the passageway without waiting to see if she followed. After a heartbeat of hesitation, Liora stepped after him. The corridor was lined with more portraits, more eyes painted in careful strokes, but she barely noticed them. All her attention was on the tall figure ahead and the mysterious steadiness of his shoulders. At the very end of the corridor, Valerius stopped before a large door of dark wood, carved with curling vines and tiny crescent moons. He touched the center of it with his palm, and a soft light flared along the carvings, tracing their lines like moonlight filling a river. The lock clicked open with a gentle sound that somehow felt final. Inside was a small, circular room lit by a single high window. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. On the far wall hung a single painting, larger than all the others in the hall. Leora stepped in behind him and felt her breath leave her chest. The woman in the portrait stood in a garden of silver flowers, a faint smile on her lips. Her hair was dark, her eyes bright, her posture both gentle and strong. On her bare wrist, painted with careful strokes, was the same crescent and thorn mark Leora carried. It would have been enough to unsettle her, but what froze her in place was not the mark, it was the face. The woman in the painting did not look exactly like Leora, but there were echoes everywhere. The shape of the mouth, the tilt of the eyes, the stubborn line of the chin. It felt like looking at an older sister she had never met, or a version of herself from a life she did not remember living. Behind her, she could feel Valerius watching, waiting for her reaction. "Do you see now," he asked quietly, "why I could not believe you came here by accident?" Leora's pulse thundered in her ears. She took a slow step closer to the painting, then another. As she reached up, almost without meaning to, and let her fingertips hover just beneath the painted wrist, a faint warmth stirred under her own skin. The mark on her arm tingled as if answering a call from far away. The candles in the little room flickered all at once. A thin line of pale light traced itself around the edge of the portrait, brightening for a heartbeat before fading again. Leora jerked her hand back, eyes wide. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Valerius did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, full of a fear that had now grown into something else as well, hope, fragile and frightening. "Yes," he said, "I saw it, and now I am more certain than ever that your coming here is no coincidence." He turned toward her, the faint light from the high window drawing solemn angles across his face. "Leora," he asked, "are you prepared for the possibility that your life, your brother's life, my life, all of this, may never be the same again?" Her answer rose in her throat, trembling on the edge of words, but before she could speak, somewhere deep in the heart of the castle, a bell began to ring. It was not the clear tone of the hour bells. This sound was lower, older, like a warning pulled up from the bones of the earth. Valerius went still, every line of his body suddenly alert. "That," he said softly, his eyes darkening, "is not a bell that should be waking." He looked at Leora, at the mark on her wrist, at the trembling light still clinging to the frame of Alara's portrait. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "Whatever has just been stirred is answering you." The old bell kept tolling as the floor shivered faintly beneath Leora's boots, each slow strike rolling through the stone like a heartbeat too large for any single chest. Dust loosened from the high ceiling and drifted down in thin, ghostly threads. The small chamber with Alara's portrait no longer felt still. It felt awake, listening. Valerius stepped in front of her, cloak sweeping between them and the doorway. His posture had changed, no longer the careful, distant king, but something more alert, a guardian suddenly sure that the danger might not be him but everything else. "The bell comes from the Hall of Oaths," he said, eyes scanning the corridor beyond. "It rings only when a promise is being tested or rewritten." Leora's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. Tested by who? He glanced back at her. By whatever power helped Alara make the first promise. Old magic, older than my rule, older than this castle. His jaw clenched. "And now apparently awake because of you." They stepped out into the corridor. The air felt charged, a low, trembling hum threaded through every breath. Far below, the bell boomed again, slower now, as if measuring their steps. As they walked, candles on the walls flared without being touched, one after another, lighting their path in a procession of flame. They had only rounded one corner when a figure hurried toward them from the shadows. A man with iron gray hair pulled back at his neck, dressed in dark, simple clothes. His eyes were sharp but not cruel, and when they flicked to Liora, they held open curiosity rather than suspicion. "My king," he said, bowing quickly, "the Hall of Oaths has unlocked itself, the seals." "I know, Corvin," Valerius cut in quietly. "You heard the bell." Corvin's gaze flicked to Leora again, and this time he seemed to really see the mark on her wrist, half glimpsed where her sleeve had slipped back. His face paled. "By the old stars," he whispered, "so the stories were true." Leora wanted to ask what stories, but there wasn't time. The bell sounded again, softer now, like a hand knocking from very far away. "Seal the outer gates," Valerius ordered. "No one enters, no one leaves. Keep the younger ones from wandering. If anyone feels called, do not let them answer." Corvin swallowed, nodded once, and hurried off without another word. Leora watched him disappear, then looked up at Valerius. "Is he afraid of me too?" "He is afraid of what follows you," Valerius replied, starting forward again. "That is not the same thing." They descended a broad staircase. The air grew cooler, touched with the dry scent of old stone and something metallic like rain on iron. Leora's pulse beat in her throat, matching the slow echo of the bell that pulsed up through the floor. At the bottom of the stairs, a corridor stretched out, long, dim, and utterly straight. At its far end stood a heavy door of dark metal, its surface carved with three interlocking circles. Leora stopped short. "You said I must never open any door with that symbol." "I did," Valerius answered, "because this door opens only for two reasons, to condemn or to heal." He looked at her, eyes grave. "Tonight, it seems it wants to know which you have come for." As they approached, the circles on the door began to glow, first a dull ember red, then a steady silver, as if unsure which light it belonged to. The old bell rang one final time and then fell silent, leaving a ringing in Leora's ears that might have been fear or expectation or both. Valerius placed his palm flat against the metal. It responded with a low, resonant tone that hummed up his arm. "Once this opens," he said without looking at her, "you cannot unknow what you will see. If you wish to turn back, Leora, say so now. I will not think you a coward." She thought of her brother lying thin and pale under a patched blanket, of the village that had closed its doors, of the portrait of Alara with eyes full of gentle, stubborn light. She thought of Valerius standing alone in his hall, feeling every cruel act in a world that had forgotten he was trying to hold it together. "I walked here to change something," she said quietly. "Even if I did not know what that was, I won't turn back at the first real door I meet." For a fleeting moment, something almost like pride crossed his face. He nodded once, then pressed harder. The three circles flared bright, then spun within each other, unlocking with a sound like distant thunder. The door parted down the middle and swung inward, revealing a wide, circular chamber sunk slightly below the level of the corridor. Steps led down into it, each stone edged with a faint, pearly light. The ceiling arched overhead like the inside of a great shell, lined with symbols Leora could not name. At the center of the room lay a shallow, round pool, its surface dark and perfectly still, reflecting nothing. Around it, carved into the floor, ran a ring of intricate writing in a language Leora did not recognize. Valerius descended first, his footsteps making almost no sound. Leora followed, feeling every echo of her boots as if the room were counting them. When they reached the bottom, the air cooled further, yet she felt a fine sweat at the back of her neck. "This is where Alara spoke the words that bound my curse," Valerius said quietly. "The promise has been waiting here ever since, listening, watching, like an old judge who never truly sleeps." Leora stepped closer to the pool. The dark surface gave nothing back, not her face, not the faint glow of the symbols. It was like looking into a sky with no stars. "What does it want from us?" she asked. "It wants to know," A new voice answered, soft and resonant, if the two of you are still worth saving. Leora sucked in a breath. The words hadn't come from Valerius. They had risen from the air itself or from the water. The pool began to ripple, though nothing had touched it. Shapes wavered beneath the surface, then cleared like memories remembered too suddenly. She saw a village that could have been hers, but older, bathed in lantern light instead of lamps. Children laughed in the square. On the hill, the castle loomed, but its windows were brighter, less guarded. Then the scene twisted, flames, shouting, arrows arcing in the dark, figures in cloaks and armor. A woman with the same crescentan thorn mark raising her hands between them, pleading. Ilara, Leora thought. The image shifted again. Leora's stomach tightened. Now she saw her own village, the baker's closed door, the way people turned away, her brother coughing weakly as she tucked the blanket around him. She watched herself walk toward the forest alone, shawl pulled tight against the cold. The voice, neither male nor female, old but clear, spoke again. Fear built walls between your kinds, promises tried to bridge them, then fear broke the bridge and called it wisdom. A pause, like a long, slow breath. Now the mark returns, the choice returns with it. Valerius stepped closer to the pool, his expression controlled but strained. What choice? He asked. Ilara bound my existence to every cruel act of my kind. I feel them, burn with them. Must the world have only that endless punishment for endless mistakes? Images flickered across the water. A vampire bearing fangs and then turning away instead of feeding. A human lowering a weapon instead of firing. Small mercies, tiny acts of restraint. Each one caused a faint shimmer of light on the surface. The curse worked, the voice said. Cruelty carries a cost. Because you feel what your people do, you have changed how they live. Many graves are empty because of the pain you endured, King of the Night. Valerius's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Then the pool darkened. Now it showed other scenes, hidden attacks, secret cruelties committed by those who relished pain, towns whispering horror tales, vampires hunted on sight, good and bad alike, fear spreading out on both sides like spilled ink. But the promise was broken when Ilara died by treachery, the voice continued. The mark disappeared. The bridge did not finish being built. Your pain alone cannot heal what was shattered. A sacrifice without a witness becomes only suffering. Leora swallowed. Why bring me here then? She asked, her voice wobbling only a little. I am not a seer, I cannot do magic, I can barely keep one person alive. The pool's surface calmed, then began to shine softly from within, like starlight caught under glass. A new image formed, this time not of past or present, but something that felt like both and neither. She saw herself standing where she was now, older by a few years, stronger in her posture, eyes steady. Beside her stood Valerius, his face less haunted, the lines around his mouth softened by something like quiet hope. You carry blood bound to the first promise, the voice said. Ilara's line did not end, it hid. It learned humility in small houses and cold seasons. It learned resilience in empty cupboards and closed doors. In you, her courage wakes again, not in a tower of scholars, but in a girl who has known hunger. The image faded, the water stilled. The choice is this, the voice said, and the entire room seemed to lean in to listen. The curse can remain as it is, the king alone feeling the burn of every cruelty, bearing it in silence, slowly breaking under the weight. You may leave, girl of the mark, your brother may live a full, quiet life. The world will not grow much worse, but it will not heal. Fear will remain the language both sides trust most. Valerius closed his eyes. The option, spoken aloud like that, sounded almost like relief. Or, Leora asked, her hands now clenched so tightly that her nails bit into her palms. Or the promise can be completed, the voice replied. The mark-bearer may bind herself to the bridge Ilara tried to build, not as a sacrifice to die, but as a living witness to both sides, a thread that ties human and vampire fates together. The king would no longer carry his burden alone, you would share it, you would feel cruelty, too, not as he does, but enough to understand it and speak against it. In return, your presence would soften the weight he bears. The hunger for fear and blood would lessen where you walk. The choice to show kindness would grow louder in those near you. Leora's breath caught. You want to give me part of his pain? Yes, the voice said simply, and part of his power to protect. You would stand between worlds as Alara once did. You would not live an ordinary life. It would be longer than most and lonelier at times. You might save many you never meet and lose some you love. A different ache rose in her chest. My brother, she whispered, what happens to him if I choose this? The water brightened, then shifted. She saw her brother, not as he was now, but stronger color in his cheeks, sitting on a bench in a courtyard she did not yet recognize, reading a book beside a fountain. He looked up as if hearing someone call, and the image blurred. He will live, the voice said. He will be cared for if the king keeps his side of the promise. You may not always stand beside his bed, but your choice will guard him in other ways. Valerius stepped forward sharply. If she chooses this, she will become a target, he said, his voice edged with anger that sounded like fear in disguise. The ones who betrayed Alara may be gone, but others like them remain. They will not want a living bridge. They will try to break it, again. Then you must do what you failed to do before, the voice answered, not unkindly. You must protect more than your own heart. He flinched, and Liora saw the wound in that truth. He had failed Alara once. Whatever power ruled this hall would not let him forget it. Inside her, two parts of herself wrestled. One was a girl from a hungry village who wanted nothing more than a warm bed, a safe brother, and days without fear. The other was something older, quieter, that kept remembering the way Valerius had looked when he spoke of feeling every act of cruelty as fire in his bones. I don't want anyone's pain, she said, her voice shaking. But I've been surrounded by it my whole life anyway. It doesn't go away just because I pretend I can't see it. She turned to Valerius. If I leave now, you're still cursed. Humans still tell stories that make you a monster and themselves victims, even when they're the ones closing doors. Vampires still fight to be feared instead of understood. We go on like that forever, just slightly less terrible because you're paying for all of it. Alone. His eyes met hers. For a moment, they glinted red, then deepened into a color that almost held gold around the edges, lit by something fragile. You would tie yourself to all of that, he said softly, for people who shut you out, for a king you just met. I would tie myself, she answered, because someone has to start doing more than surviving. She drew a breath that trembled, then steadied. And because I don't think Alara died just so we could all decide it was too hard to try again. Silence fell in the chamber. Even the distant creaks of the castle seemed to fade, as if the entire building were skipping a heartbeat on purpose to hear more clearly. Valerius's voice, when it came, was rougher than before. If I refuse to let her do this, he asked the unseen judge, if I say one cursed life is enough. Then the promise remains broken, the voice replied. She carries the mark, but it lies dormant. Your pain continues. Her days pass like all the others in her village, bright and small and soon forgotten. The world turns away from its chance to choose better. A pause. It is not mercy to protect someone from their own courage, King. He looked at Liora, eyes searching. Something in him warred, the instinct to shelter her from everything he knew of long, dark years, and the deep, old understanding that some burdens must be shared or they crush everything underneath them. All my life, he said slowly, I have been punished for the cruelty of others. I accepted it because I had earned part of that punishment myself. If I agree to this, if I let you share even a fraction of it, I am asking you to step into a world of pain you did not create. There is no honor in dragging you with me. She thought of the way he had offered her bread before asking her name, of how gently he had held her wrist despite his fear, of the portrait of Alara hanging alone in that little room, her mark glowing for 100 silent years with no one to answer it. You're not dragging me, Liora said softly. I'm walking. Her hands shook as she reached out, bridging the distance between them. For a moment he didn't move, his gaze locked on her outstretched fingers. Then, with a care that felt almost reverent, Valerius took her hand. His palm was cool, but his grip was steady. The instant their hands joined, the mark on Leora's wrist flared with gentle heat. Light spilled from it like liquid moonfire, threading up her arm and across to his. For a heartbeat, she almost pulled away, but the look in his eyes anchored her. He did not look afraid for himself. He looked afraid for her, and still he did not let go. The pool responded. Its surface burst into radiance, filling the chamber with shifting silver and soft gold. Images rushed by too quickly to catch, human hands pulling wounded vampires out of sunlight, vampires standing between human villages and darker creatures that stalked the night. Children of both kinds playing in fields, doors opening instead of closing. The voice spoke one last time, now warm with something that might have been contentment. Then the promise is remade, not as it was, but as it must be now. A king who feels the cost of cruelty and a bearer of the mark who reminds him what he protects. Two lives bound in shared responsibility, not in chains. The light wrapped around their joined hands and sank slowly into their skin. Leora gasped as a rush of sensation swept through her, not physical pain, but an echo of it, like a distant storm felt in the bones. 100 small cruelties brushed against her awareness and then softened, as if filtered through someone stronger. Valerius tightened his hold, grounding her. For the first time, she felt a little of what his endless days must have been, each unkindness like a spark against the inside of his ribs. But as the new bond settled, some of that fire spread between them instead of burning only him. It did not vanish, but it stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a warning bell they could both hear. The light dimmed, the pool calmed. The symbols on the floor glowed once, then faded back to a soft, sleeping shimmer. "It is done," the voice whispered, now distant. "Guard this bridge well, or the world will teach you again how easily they fall." Silence followed, real silence, without humming, without bells. Leora realized she was breathing hard. Sweat slicked her palms. Her wrist still tingled, the mark there now brighter and more defined, as if written anew. Valerius let go of her hand slowly, as if afraid she might stumble. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. She listened inward for a moment. There was fear, yes, and a strange new ache that did not quite belong to her alone. But under that was something steadier, a sense of standing where she was meant to be, even if the path ahead was dark. "Different," she admitted. "Like I'm suddenly carrying a bag I can't put down, but it doesn't feel wrong, just heavy." She looked up at him. "And you?" He drew a breath out of habit, not need, and blinked as if testing his own body. "Lighter," he said, almost surprised. "Not free, this will never be that, but less alone." A faint, disbelieving smile touched his mouth. "I did not think that was still possible." They climbed the steps back to the corridor. As the heavy door with the 3 circles swung shut behind them, the symbols faded to their old, quiet darkness. Somewhere above, the normal bells of the castle chimed the hour, clear and bright, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. When they reached the main hall again, Corvin waited near the base of the stairs, worry carved into his features. "The bells stopped," he said quickly. "The younger ones are restless but calm, no one seems harmed." "What?" His eyes fell on Leora's wrist, where the mark now glowed softly through the fabric of her sleeve, like a small moon beneath cloth. He looked between her and Valerius, understanding dawning like a slow sunrise. She drew in a long breath, then released it slowly. The world did not look less dangerous than it had the night before. If anything, she saw more clearly how fragile everything was. But between the fragile pieces, she now also saw threads of possibility, thin, bright lines running from her brother's bed to this balcony, from this castle to the village, from humans to the so-called monsters they had feared for generations. Once she had thought the only way to survive was to take whatever scraps of kindness she could find and cling to them in the shadows. Now, standing beside a vampire king who had chosen compassion over power, she understood there was another way, to become the kind of person who gave that kindness out instead, even when it cost something. Valerius looked at her, his gaze steady, as if he could sense the shift inside her. "Welcome home, Leora," he said softly, "to the place where everything changed the moment you walked through the door." She nodded, the truth of it settling over her like a mantle that finally fit. "Not just your home," she replied. "Ours." The sun climbed higher, setting the clouds aflame. Far below, the village stirred. High above, in the hidden halls of the castle, old portraits watched in painted silence as the first real bridge in 100 years stepped into the light. Leora, who had entered the Vampire King's home as a poor girl seeking nothing more than work and warmth, stood beside him now as something much rarer. a living promise that the darkness and the light could learn at last to share the same sky.